Margaret's house stood quietly at the end of a narrow Oregon street, wrapped in the stillness of late autumn. The maple trees outside had already shed their leaves, and the wind whistled through the branches like a forgotten tune. Inside, everything was too neat. The framed photos, the flower vase on the table, and the ticking clock on the wall all carried a sense of someone trying to hold on to normalcy. But nothing felt alive. Not since her husband, Richard, had passed away 3 years ago. Margaret was 61 now. Her silver hair always pinned neatly behind her ears. She spent her mornings sitting by the window, sipping tea from a chipped cup Richard had once bought her on a road trip. Every day followed the same quiet pattern: tea, a short walk, a few chores, then hours of silence that stretched endlessly. The television played soft music, not for entertainment but just to fill the emptiness that echoed through the house. She often thought about her son, Ethan. He was her only child, a kind and gentle soul who had moved to New York after college to build his career. He rarely visited, though he called every few weeks. His voice always sounded rushed, tired, but polite. Margaret never told him how lonely she was. She didn't want to be a burden. Mothers always worry more about their children than themselves. And she was no different. One cold November afternoon, as the sky turned grey, Margaret sat with a blanket over her knees and watched the rain begin to fall. Drops slid down the window like quiet tears. She thought about how the seasons kept changing while her life stayed the same. The only sound was the clock's steady tick. She sighed and whispered to the empty room, "It's too quiet in here." Then the phone rang. She almost didn't answer. It had been days since anyone called, but when she picked it up and heard the voice on the other end, her heart leapt. "Mom?" It was Ethan. His tone was calm but carried a weight she couldn't ignore. "Ethan." "Oh, sweetheart. It's so good to hear your voice. Are you all right?" There was a pause. "I think I'm coming home for a while," he said finally. His words were soft but certain, like he had made up his mind after a long struggle. Margaret's throat tightened. She didn't ask why, though a dozen questions filled her heart. "Of course, come home," she said, trying to sound casual, but tears formed in her eyes. "I'll make your favorite soup." The days that followed were filled with quiet excitement. She cleaned the house, changed the curtains, and even polished the old wooden floors. Every corner seemed to glow with new energy, as if the house itself was waiting for him. She opened the windows to let the fresh air in, and filled the kitchen with the smell of cinnamon and bread. When Ethan finally arrived, it was late evening. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of rain and pine. Margaret stood at the door, her hands trembling slightly as headlights swept across the driveway. The doorbell rang, and when she opened it, there he was, taller, older, with tired eyes and a small, weary smile. "Hi, Mom," he said softly. She didn't speak. She just reached out and pulled him into her arms. It was the kind of hug that erased years of distance and reminded them both of what truly mattered. He held her tightly, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "I missed you." Margaret's heart flooded with warmth she hadn't felt in so long. "You're home now," she whispered. Later that night, after dinner, they sat by the fireplace. Ethan's gaze lingered on the dancing flames, his face half lit, half shadowed. Margaret noticed how different he seemed. He used to laugh easily, but now his expressions were quiet, thoughtful. His shoulders carried something heavy, something unspoken. She wanted to ask, but she didn't. She had learned that sometimes silence is the kindest language. So, she just poured him another cup of tea and said, "It's nice having company again." Ethan smiled faintly. "It's nice to be home." As he spoke, Margaret noticed a flicker of pain in his eyes, the kind that comes from heartbreak or disappointment. She sensed it instantly, the way only a mother can. But she stayed quiet. There would be time for truth later. For now, all she needed was this, the sound of his voice filling her empty home again. That night, when Ethan went to bed, Margaret stood by the doorway of his old room. It looked almost the same as when he was a teenager, the bookshelf filled with dusty novels, the baseball trophy from high school, and the small lamp with a crooked shade. She watched him for a moment, asleep under the soft glow of the light. A smile touched her lips as she whispered, "Welcome home, my boy." She went to her own room and sat on the bed, feeling something she hadn't felt in years' peace. The house wasn't silent anymore. It breathed again. It lived again. And though she didn't yet know why Ethan had really come home, she believed one thing deeply. Maybe life was giving them both another chance to heal, to reconnect, to rediscover warmth after years of quiet sorrow. Outside, the rain had stopped. The moon peeked through the clouds, casting a silver glow across the porch. Margaret stood by the window once more, but this time she smiled. For the first time in years, the silence of her home no longer felt lonely. It felt full of promise in the soft glow of the night. A quiet truth settled in her heart. Love doesn't always come in grand gestures. Sometimes it comes back home, carrying a suitcase and a tired smile. And sometimes that's enough to make the world feel warm again. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the curtains, warming the quiet kitchen. Margaret stood by the stove, stirring oatmeal, when she heard soft footsteps behind her. Ethan walked in, hair slightly messy, wearing an old sweater she hadn't seen in years. For a moment, she saw a glimpse of the boy he once was, the one who used to run down these same stairs before school, laughing and full of dreams. "Morning, Mom," he said, his voice calm but low. "Morning, sweetheart." "Sit. I made breakfast," she replied, smiling. She placed a bowl in front of him, noticing how pale he looked, how his shoulders seemed to carry invisible weight. He smiled faintly, but his eyes didn't match the smile. They talked about little things, how the neighborhood had changed, how Mrs. Parker next door still grew the best roses. But every now and then, Margaret caught him drifting off, lost in thought. When she asked if he was feeling all right, he'd nod quickly and change the topic. She didn't push. Some truths take time to surface. The days passed quietly. Ethan spent hours fixing things around the house. The squeaky door, the broken railing, even the old radio that hadn't worked in years. Margaret watched him from the window, feeling both proud and worried. He wasn't just keeping himself busy. He was avoiding something. One afternoon, while folding laundry, she heard him on the phone in the next room. His voice was low but tense. "No, I just needed some space. Please stop calling me for now." Then silence. Margaret didn't move. She didn't need to know everything to understand that her son was hurting. That evening, as they ate dinner, she finally asked gently, "Ethan, is something wrong?" He looked at her, fork halfway to his mouth, and sighed. "It's not work, Mom, it's Lily." Margaret froze for a moment. She remembered Lily, the beautiful, kind woman Ethan had planned to marry. She had sent them photos of her wedding dress months ago. Margaret had even bought a gift. "What happened?" she asked softly. Ethan leaned back, staring at the table. "She left. Said she didn't want the same life anymore. Said I cared too much about building a future, and not enough about living in the present." His voice cracked a little. "I thought we were happy." Margaret's heart ached. She had no words that could ease that kind of pain. She reached out and placed her hand over his. "Sometimes people love us but don't know how to stay," she said. "And sometimes that's not our fault." He looked at her, eyes glistening. "I thought she was the one, Mom. I was ready to spend my life with her." "I know," Margaret whispered. "But maybe this heartbreak is just leading you to something different. Something that fits who you truly are. They didn't speak for a while after that. The only sound was the soft ticking of the kitchen clock. Ethan nodded slowly, and in that small gesture, she saw the quiet beginning of healing. Over the next few days, Ethan stayed close to home. He spent time fixing old photo frames, organizing the garage, helping Margaret with groceries. When she thanked him, he shrugged and said, "I like keeping busy." But she could see through it. He was rebuilding himself piece by piece. Every night, after dinner, they'd sit by the fireplace. Margaret would knit while Ethan stared into the flames, lost in thought. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was peaceful, almost healing. Sometimes he'd tell her stories from New York, about late nights at the office or the city lights from his apartment window. She listened quietly, grateful just to hear his voice. One evening, as rain tapped softly on the roof, Ethan said quietly, "It feels strange being back here. Everything's the same, but I'm not." Margaret looked up from her knitting. "That's what life does, sweetheart. It changes us. The places stay, but the people inside them keep growing." He smiled faintly. "I guess I forgot how it feels to slow down." "Maybe slowing down is exactly what you need," she replied gently. From that night, something in him shifted. He started to take morning walks with her, just like they used to when he was young. They'd watch the fog lift from the trees and talk about simple things: the smell of rain, the sound of birds, memories of Richard, his father. Those small moments brought life back into their days. Margaret noticed how Ethan started sleeping better. His laughter returned, even if softly. He still missed Lily. She knew that the pain didn't rule his heart anymore. He was learning to live with it. One afternoon, as they sat in the garden, he looked at her and said, "I forgot how much peace this house holds." She smiled. "This house missed you, Ethan. It feels warm again." He looked around the yard, then back at her. "Maybe I needed to come back here to remember who I am." She nodded. Home has a way of reminding us of what truly matters. Later that evening, as Margaret washed dishes and Ethan dried them beside her, she realized something: her son had not just come home to heal from heartbreak. He had come home to find himself again. That night, when the house grew quiet, Ethan stood by the window, looking out at the soft glow of the porch light. Margaret joined him. "Thank you for letting me come back, Mum," he said. "You never needed to ask," she replied, smiling. He looked at her with tired but peaceful eyes. "It feels good to be here. I don't feel so lost anymore." She placed her hand on his shoulder. "You're never lost, Ethan. You just needed a little light to guide you back." And for the first time in a long while, Ethan believed her as they turned off the lights and went to bed. Margaret felt her heart settle. Her home, once silent and cold, now pulsed with quiet warmth. The pain in her son's eyes had not vanished completely, but it was fading, slowly, gently. Just like winter turning into spring. And in that peaceful stillness, Margaret knew sometimes love doesn't just heal us. It brings us home. Winter arrived quietly, blanketing the small Oregon town in white. Snow covered the streets and rooftops, softening every sound. Inside Margaret's house, warmth glowed from the fireplace as the scent of cinnamon and fresh pine filled the air. Ethan had decided to stay through the season, taking remote projects from his firm. The house, once lonely and still, now felt alive again. Each morning, Margaret would wake to the sound of movement downstairs. Ethan brewing coffee, humming faintly to an old tune. Sometimes he'd shovel snow from the porch before she even got out of bed. When she walked into the kitchen, the table would already be set, and he'd smile, saying, "I remember how you like your toast, Mom, extra crisp." Margaret couldn't help but notice how much lighter he seemed lately. The heavy sadness that shadowed his eyes when he first arrived was slowly fading. He laughed more, talked more, and even teased her gently like he used to. She could feel the change her son was finding his peace again. They spent the days decorating for Christmas. Ethan brought down the old boxes from the attic, filled with ornaments and family memories. Together they hung twinkling lights around the windows, placed candles on the shelves, and trimmed the tree in the corner of the living room. As Margaret hung a small star on the top, she looked at Ethan and smiled softly. "Your father used to lift you up so you could do this," she said. Ethan chuckled. "I remember. I nearly dropped it one year." They both laughed, and for the first time in years, the sound felt whole. One snowy afternoon, while Ethan was fixing the broken fence outside, a woman approached. She wore a beige coat, her cheeks rosy from the cold. "Hi," she said with a friendly smile. "I'm Claire. I just moved into the house down the street." Ethan smiled back, brushing snow from his gloves. "Welcome to the neighborhood." Claire explained that her car had gotten stuck in the snowbank nearby and asked if he had a shovel. He quickly offered to help. Within minutes he had cleared the snow and freed her car. She thanked him warmly, and they ended up talking for a while about the cold weather, local cafes, and the quiet charm of small-town life. That evening, when Margaret asked who the visitor was, Ethan simply said, "Just a new neighbor." "She's nice." But Margaret caught the small spark in his tone, the quiet interest he tried to hide. In the days that followed, Claire began stopping by occasionally. Sometimes she brought muffins, sometimes coffee. Once she even joined them for dinner after getting caught in a snowstorm. She was kind, gentle, and had a soft laugh that seemed to warm even the coldest corners of the house. Margaret watched the way Ethan relaxed when she was around, the way his shoulders eased, the way he smiled without forcing it. She noticed how they'd sit by the fireplace, talking for hours about books, travel, and the dreams they both once had but hadn't chased yet. One evening, after Claire left, Margaret looked at her son and said softly, "You seem happier these days." Ethan smiled, slightly embarrassed. "She's easy to talk to, Mom. It's been a long time since I've felt that." "I can see that," she replied warmly. "And I'm glad." The holidays came and went peacefully. Snow kept falling, but the house remained bright and full of laughter. Ethan and Claire built a snowman in the yard one morning, and Margaret watched from the window, her heart swelling with quiet joy. She hadn't seen Ethan smile like that in years. It wasn't just happiness. It was healing. Sometimes, at night, Margaret would think about how life worked in mysterious ways. Her son had come home broken, searching for peace, and somehow, life had given him not just comfort, but a new beginning. One evening, as they sat together by the fire, Margaret looked at Ethan and said, "You know, I think your father would have liked Claire." Ethan looked into the flames and nodded. "I think he would too." He fell silent for a moment, then added, "It's strange, Mom. I thought I'd never feel whole again after Lily left. But coming here, it reminded me what love really means. It's not always about holding on, it's about finding warmth again, even after loss." Margaret's eyes softened. That's the kind of love that lasts. Outside, snowflakes drifted past the window, glowing softly in the lamplight. Ethan leaned back, his expression peaceful. For the first time in years, he looked free. Over the next few weeks, the bond between Ethan and Claire grew naturally. There were no promises, no rush, just gentle understanding. She would often stop by to help Margaret in the kitchen, or join Ethan for walks through the snow-covered park. Sometimes they'd bring back hot cocoa for Margaret and sit together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the frozen sky in gold and pink. Margaret felt gratitude she couldn't put into words. Her home was warm again, not just from the fire, but from love that flowed quietly through its walls. One evening, Ethan brought in fresh logs for the fireplace and tucked a blanket around his mother's shoulders. "You warm enough?" he asked Dot. She smiled up at him. "I am, now that you're here." He sat beside her, glancing at the twinkling lights around the tree. "You know, Mom," he said softly, "I think this place saved me." "No, sweetheart," she whispered, her eyes glistening. "You saved yourself. This house just gave you space to remember how strong you are." He smiled, squeezing her hand gently. "And maybe I'm ready to start over." Margaret's heart filled with quiet pride. "You already have." As the fire crackled and snow fell softly outside, Margaret realized that love, no matter how it arrives, always finds its way back home. That night, she went to bed with a heart full of peace. The silence that once haunted her house was gone, replaced by the sound of laughter, soft conversation, and the warmth of hope reborn. For the first time in years, Margaret didn't fear tomorrow. Her son was healing. Her home was alive. And somewhere between the pain and the snow, life had begun to shine again. Spring arrived softly, melting the snow and filling the air with the scent of rain and blooming flowers. Margaret's small Oregon home looked brighter than ever, windows open, curtains dancing with the wind, and laughter often drifting from the porch. Ethan had decided to stay longer, working from home and helping around the house. What was once a quiet, lonely place now pulsed with life. Every morning, he and Margaret shared breakfast on the porch. She'd sip her tea while he read the newspaper, and the birds sang around them as if the world itself had found peace again. Sometimes, Claire would join them, bringing fresh muffins or flowers from her garden. Margaret loved those mornings, three people talking softly, the sun glowing over the fields and joy filling the air in the simplest ways. Ethan had changed. The pain that once clouded his heart was now replaced with calm and purpose. He worked during the day, but he never rushed. He cooked dinner for his mother, fixed things around the house, and always made sure she didn't lift anything heavy. Margaret often joked, "You're acting like I'm fragile," and he'd smile, replying, "I'm just taking care of you, Mum." One afternoon, Margaret sat in the garden, trimming roses, when Ethan walked out carrying lemonade. "You need to rest," he said, setting the glass beside her. She smiled, looking up at him. "You sound like your father. He used to say the same thing." Ethan smiled faintly. "I think I learned from the best." They sat together under the tree, watching the petals flutter in the soft breeze. Margaret's heart swelled with quiet gratitude. Her son had come home broken, but now he stood tall again, gentle, kind, and stronger than ever. Claire often visited after work. Sometimes she helped in the garden. Sometimes she joined them for dinner. Her presence brought even more warmth to the home. There was something natural about her and Ethan, no pressure, no big confessions, just a steady closeness that grew with each passing day. Margaret noticed the way Ethan's eyes softened whenever Claire spoke, how his laughter sounded lighter when she was near. She didn't say anything, but in her heart, she silently hoped this connection would bloom into something beautiful. One evening, the three of them sat outside watching the sunset. The sky turned shades of gold and pink, and a soft silence surrounded them. Claire leaned back in her chair and said, "There's something peaceful about this place. It feels like time slows down here." Ethan nodded. "That's what I needed. I forgot what it felt like to breathe." Margaret listened quietly, her heart full. After so much loneliness, her home was alive again, with conversation, laughter, and love that felt real and lasting. Weeks passed and the bond between Ethan and Claire deepened. They took long walks by the lake, shared stories about their past, and sometimes stopped by the local farmers' market together. Margaret often watched them from the porch when they returned, carrying groceries and smiling at each other. It reminded her of when she and Richard were young simple love, built on kindness and understanding. One night, after dinner, Ethan sat beside his mother as she knitted by the fire. The glow flickered across their faces, casting soft light across the room. "Mum," he said gently, "do you ever feel like life gives us second chances?" She looked up, smiling. "Every day. You just have to be brave enough to take them." He nodded slowly, then said, "I think I've been given one." Margaret reached for his hand. "You deserve it." There was a quiet pause, filled with unspoken emotion. He squeezed her hand and whispered, "Thank you for letting me come home, for being patient with me, for reminding me what love looks like." Tears filled her eyes. "Ethan, you've always been my reason to keep going. Having you here makes this house feel alive again." He smiled softly. "Then I guess I'll stay a little longer." Days turned into weeks, and spring deepened into early summer. The house looked vibrant, flowers blooming, windows open, laughter echoing from room to room. Margaret's health improved with every passing day. Her steps lighter, her heart stronger. Ethan often said, "You look happier, Mum," and she would reply, "Because I am." One sunny afternoon, Ethan and Claire took Margaret to the lake for a picnic. They spread a blanket on the grass and shared sandwiches, fruit, and lemonade. The water shimmered under the sunlight, and the sound of laughter filled the air. Margaret leaned back against a tree, watching the two of them tease each other playfully. For a moment, she felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Her son was happy, truly happy. As the sun began to set, Ethan sat beside her, his hand resting gently on hers. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he said, looking out over the lake. "It is," she whispered. "And so are you, Ethan. You've found your light again." He smiled at her, his eyes reflecting the fading sunlight. "Maybe it was here all along. I just needed to come home to see it." They sat in silence, the soft rustle of wind and the gentle hum of the world around them filling the air. Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of the moment sink deep into her soul. That night, when they returned home, Ethan helped her inside and covered her with a blanket on the couch. The fire crackled softly as they sat together, the room glowing with golden light. "You know, Mum," he said quietly, "I used to think healing meant forgetting. But now I realize it means remembering without the pain." Margaret's voice trembled as she replied, "That's the truest thing you've ever said." Ethan wrapped an arm around her shoulders, holding her close. "Your presence saved me, Mom. You reminded me that love never leaves, just changes shape." Tears filled her eyes as she leaned into him. "And your presence warms this home more than the sun ever could." They sat together in the quiet, the fire glowing, the night calm. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of spring. Inside, there was peace, laughter, and love that would never fade. The house that once stood silent was now filled with warmth that would stay forever, not just from fire or light, but from hearts that had finally found their way home.